The racist and corrupt police officers arrested the black woman, the director of the FBI, inside a courtroom, parading her in handcuffs without even knowing who she truly was. And as they laughed, as they celebrated what they thought was a victory, they had no idea the karma that was already in motion, no clue of the storm she had prepared. What she did to them left an entire nation speechless. It started with a smirk, one officer, eyes narrow, staring her down with the kind of arrogance that drips from a long history of unchecked power. He didn't just see a black woman standing in the back of a courtroom. He saw a target. An opportunity. A personal vendetta that had been simmering for years, ever since his once promising career had come crashing down under the weight of a federal investigation he believed she had orchestrated. And in that moment, he thought he finally had the upper hand. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that she was steps ahead. And everything he was about to do, she had already accounted for. "You again," he muttered as he stepped closer, hand hovering near his holster as if intimidation alone could erase the truth. "Didn't expect to see you here, thought we got rid of you for good." She didn't flinch. She didn't move. That silence, that calm, it only enraged him more. When she reached into her purse to pull out her credentials, his reaction was instantaneous and aggressive. "Hands where I can see, M." "Now," he barked. Before she could even explain, two other officers rushed in, grabbing her arms, forcing her down onto the floor. One of them twisted her wrist while the other ripped her bag from her shoulder, papers and identification scattering across the polished marble like confetti. People in the courtroom gasped. Cell phones went up. But none of it mattered, not to them. They were in control. At least, that's what they believed. She tried to speak, her voice composed yet strained, "You're making a mistake," but she was cut off mid-sentence by the brutal snap of handcuffs around her wrists. "Save it," the lead officer sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ain't no mistake here. You match the description. A suspicious woman loitering around court property. That's all we need." And just like that, a black woman, dressed professionally, standing peacefully, doing her job, was shoved through a public courtroom like a criminal, as the people around watched in disbelief. But not a single officer asked questions. Not one stopped to look at the ID that lay face up on the floor. None of them paused to wonder why someone like her, elegant, composed, precise, would possibly be a threat. Because they didn't see her. They only saw the color of her skin. The lead officer smiled as he walked beside her, relishing in the chaos he had created. "Funny how people like you always think you're smarter than the system. Well, let's see how smart you are behind bars." Another officer laughed from behind, adding, "She'll be lucky to make it past booking without a record. Let's show her how things really work around here." And as they exited the building, a third officer turned to the press, raising his hand as if waving to fans, shouting, "We got her, boys." The whole courthouse saw it. One more problem off the streets. But what they didn't know, not yet, was that she was the one who had set the stage for all of it. Because weeks before that moment, the FBI had launched a covert operation into internal corruption within the local police department, a unit riddled with brutality complaints, falsified arrests, and racial profiling. And she had volunteered to oversee the investigation herself, going undercover to uncover the rot from the inside. She knew the risk. She knew the officers. And most importantly, she knew him. The same officer who was now gripping her arm tightly, the same man who had blamed her for ruining his career when the FBI had taken down his illegal side deals with local traffickers. Everything he was doing now, from the false arrest to the public shaming, was being captured. Microcameras stitched into her blouse. A recording device in her belt buckle. Every slur. Every threat. Every laugh. All of it sent live to a secured FBI server in D.C. And still, she didn't flinch. Not when they shoved her into the back of the cruiser. Not when they mocked her intelligence. Not even when they told her she'd never see daylight again. Because she wasn't there to be saved. She was there to burn them all down. And the moment they'd cuffed her, the very moment they humiliated her in front of dozens of cameras and courtroom spectators, they'd walked right into her trap. But the world didn't know that yet. The footage hadn't dropped. The headlines hadn't exploded. The officers didn't know that federal agents were already circling, watching, waiting for the signal. All the world saw, all the people saw, was yet another black woman being silenced. Yet another professional stripped of her dignity. And yet another day where justice took a step back. Because for now, the only thing the public saw, was the woman in cuffs. But soon, they'd see the truth. They'd see the fire. They'd see the fallout. Because the truth doesn't stay buried for long, especially when it's armed with a badge, a plan, and receipts. So when the press showed up at the precinct, asking questions, when the department scrambled to clarify their actions, when video started leaking from witnesses in the courthouse, there was only one question echoing across every screen, every headline, every living room: who was this woman? And when the truth came out, when the world found out exactly who they had arrested, and why she had let it happen, the fallout would be seismic. Because this wasn't just about one arrest. This was about every time someone got away with it. Every time a complaint was ignored. Every time a racist officer smiled because he thought no one would ever hold him accountable. She was the reckoning. And as they laughed behind closed doors, filing their false reports, drinking their coffee, bragging about putting another one in the system, they didn't know that she was about to rewrite the story. Because the director of the FBI doesn't go down without a war. And she had just declared one. But what did she do next? And how did she turn the entire system on its head, with the entire nation watching? Stay with us. You won't believe how this ends. Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this. Here on Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. This channel is a space of respect, justice, and powerful storytelling, and we believe stories like this matter because your voice, your dignity, and your truth matter. If you've ever been judged unfairly or felt unseen, this one's for you. Stay strong. Keep rising. Now, get ready for a story that will shake you. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and let's dive into this powerful twist together. She wasn't born powerful. She earned it. Every title. Every step. Every scar. Her name was Ayanna, and before anyone knew her as the director of the FBI, she was a black girl growing up in the south side of Richmond, Virginia, where dreams were big but belief was scarce. Her childhood was a careful dance between survival and silence, between code switching at school and staying out of sight at home. Her mother, Dolores, worked 2 jobs, one cleaning offices and another cleaning homes, and every night she'd come home with fingers swollen and knees stiff, but still found the strength to press her hands to Ayanna's face and say, "Baby, you don't gotta fight like me, just learn the rules so you can rewrite them." Ayanna took that to heart. She read everything. Listened to everything. Watched the way people moved. Noticed what they praised, what they ignored. By the time she was 16, she knew how to disarm a threat with a question and how to break down a lie with silence. She wasn't the loudest girl in the room, but when she did speak, people leaned in. After graduating top of her class, she attended Howard University on a scholarship, double majoring in criminal justice and psychology. While her peers were still navigating dorm life, Ayanna was already interning with federal agencies, studying patterns of institutional bias and profiling, chasing not just justice, but systems that tried to suffocate it. By 33, she was leading internal affairs investigations. By 38, she was tasked with restructuring a regional FBI division with a history of racial discrimination complaints. And by 43, she was chosen, quietly, intentionally, to become the first black woman to hold the title of FBI director. There was no press conference. No welcome ceremony. Just a sealed envelope, a private meeting, and a mission. Ayanna didn't crave attention. She craved impact. And she knew that real change didn't come with applause, it came with resistance. Richmond had changed since her childhood, but not enough. The city wore a new coat of paint, but its shadows remained the same. Certain neighborhoods still felt like forgotten corners of America, and the police department, despite its rebranding efforts, still held officers who believed they were above the law. One of them, Captain Dean Mallory, had once been untouchable, tall, charismatic, with years of decorated service and an ego twice as big. But Ayanna had seen through it. Years ago, while leading an investigation into misuse of federal resources, her team had uncovered a web of backdoor deals connected to Mallory. It hadn't been enough to put him in jail, but it had been enough to end his promotions, blacklist him from key assignments, and quietly disgrace the name he had built for himself. And though he had never found proof, he always suspected Ayanna had been the one behind it. That bitterness didn't fade. It fermented. Dean never said it out loud, but everyone in the precinct knew his posture changed when Ayanna's name was mentioned. His lips tightened. His voice dropped. He spoke about her the way you'd speak about a thief who'd never been caught, with suspicion wrapped in venom. And now, as fate would have it, she had returned to Richmond, this time with the full weight of the FBI behind her. Not to confront him directly. Not at first. But to assess quietly. To observe. To investigate. And most of all, to finish what she had started years ago. Her presence in the city wasn't public knowledge. Her cover was simple, she was part of a joint task force assessing judicial bias in courtroom sentencing. It allowed her to sit in courtrooms, observe officer behavior, and review arrest records without raising alarms. Every day she dressed in professional but unassuming clothes. Minimal makeup. No security detail. Just her mind, her badge hidden deep in her purse, and her instinct sharpened like a blade. She moved through the halls like a shadow, absorbing every word, every shift in energy. The courthouse itself was a maze of tension. Marble floors scuffed by rushed steps. Fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, casting a sterile coldness over every exchange. Security guards with bored expressions. Lawyers on autopilot. And police officers, especially a few, who moved like they owned the place. Officers like Mallory, who walked into the courtroom each day not with duty, but with dominance. There was no humility in his stride, no curiosity in his gaze. Just entitlement and certainty that no one would ever question him again. And yet, she was there. Every day. Sitting quietly in the back. Taking notes. Watching. Some noticed her. Most ignored her. But Mallory noticed. The first time he locked eyes with her, he froze for a moment, not in fear, but in recognition. He didn't know what she was doing there. Couldn't prove anything. But something in his gut told him she wasn't just another bureaucrat. Not after all these years. Not her. In the days that followed, the tension simmered. A few coincidences started happening, Ayanna being, randomly, flagged by security for extra screenings, her assigned courtroom suddenly changed last minute, small files from her shared access drive disappearing and reappearing. But she said nothing. She smiled. She adapted. Because she knew pressure reveals more than confrontation ever could. Mallory, however, didn't like being unsure. He thrived on control. And the idea of Ayanna, walking freely in the place he still saw as his territory, burned him from the inside. She hadn't been here in years. She had risen above him, outranked him. But here she was again, in his courthouse. In his city. And she looked right through him, as if she wasn't even afraid. That's when he made his move. It started with whispers to his team. Keep an eye on her. Something's off. Then came the manipulation of records, adjusting logs to make it seem like she was attending court sessions she hadn't been cleared for. He even managed to retrieve partial footage of her entering restricted corridors, places she was authorized to be in under her cover, but easily twisted to look suspicious. And then, came the order. On a Tuesday morning, humid and restless, Ayanna arrived early to observe a trial involving a known case of racial bias. As she entered, Mallory stood near the back wall, speaking quietly with two younger officers, Carter and Nolan. Both were ambitious, eager, but far less disciplined. When he pointed her out, he didn't give them orders. Just implications. Just enough for them to act, knowing they'd have his protection afterward. At 10:43 a.m., as the judge was preparing to call the case, the doors swung open. Ayanna was approached by two uniformed officers. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't whisper. They didn't hesitate. Carter grabbed her arm while Nolan opened his cuffs. Confused murmurs filled the courtroom. "Excuse me," Ayanna said, standing upright. "You're being detained for questioning regarding suspicious behavior in restricted areas," Carter said, gripping her wrist tighter than necessary. "I work for," she tried to say, but was immediately cut off. "Ma'am, keep your voice down and step back. You're not above the law just because you're wearing heels." Gasps echoed around the room. Phones came up. Fingers pointed. A black woman, dressed in business attire, being dragged from a courtroom full of white prosecutors and jurors. One attorney muttered, "This doesn't look right." Another whispered, is that who I think it is?" But no one stood up. No one intervened. Mallory leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking. Outside, reporters who had gathered for another case quickly turned their cameras toward the spectacle. Carter shoved Ayanna through the main doors, her bag still open, ID still inside, ignored. One reporter shouted, "Why is she being arrested?" Another screamed, "Is she the one from D.C.?" No answers. Only cuffs. Only silence. Only Mallory walking behind the officers with satisfaction painted across his face. And through it all, Ayanna didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't resist. She simply looked ahead, steady and still, as if her arrest wasn't the end, but the beginning. Because while the world watched a woman humiliated, she was watching something else. Watching the clock. Watching the trap she had set begin to tighten. But they didn't know that. Not yet. And what none of them could imagine, was just how far she was willing to go to make them pay. What would happen when the woman they cuffed finally decided to strike back? And what truth was buried beneath this city that no one was ready to face? The air inside the precinct felt heavier than usual. Not physically, but with something colder, thicker, more dangerous. Ayanna sat alone in the holding room, her wrists now free but red from the cuffs, her blazer slightly wrinkled, her expression unreadable. The fluorescent lights above flickered just enough to irritate, and the buzz of printers and low chatter outside the door served as a reminder, this place wasn't built for dignity, only for power. She rested her hands on her knees, calm but calculating, listening closely to every step that echoed down the corridor. Across the building, Dean Mallory stood in his office, arms folded, staring at the monitor that displayed the booking footage. He hadn't expected her to remain that composed. Something about her silence unnerved him more than if she had screamed. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like strategy. Nolan walked in, chuckling nervously, "She didn't even flinch, man. Not once." "You saw her face?" Mallory didn't turn around, just muttered, "Yeah. I saw it." Meanwhile, the whispers had already started. Officers talking low in corners, clerks double-checking arrest logs, reporters camped outside waiting for a press statement that wasn't coming. Even within the walls of the department, people who didn't know Ayanna were starting to feel something was off. A few had seen her around the courthouse for days, and now suddenly she was being treated like a suspect. Carter passed by the break room, overhearing two detectives debating whether her arrest was even legal. "I mean, did they actually confirm her identity?" one asked. "Hell if I know," the other replied, "but you think Mallory would pull something like that without backup?" They both looked at each other, unsure. Back in the holding room, Ayanna was visited by Internal Liaison Officer Simone Whitaker, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. Simone had been looped in only minutes ago when a mysterious flag on Ayanna's file triggered a confidential alert, a flag that had instructions not to be ignored. She entered the room cautiously, her badge visible but unspoken, and sat across from Ayanna with a quiet, deliberate grace. "You've caused quite a stir today," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "Is that what they're calling it?" Simone hesitated before leaning forward. "I want to help you, but I need to know what this is." "Who are you, really?" Ayanna smiled faintly. "I'm exactly who they didn't expect me to be." Upstairs, Mallory was already rehearsing the press release. He'd spoken with the deputy chief, carefully framing the arrest as a precautionary action taken in light of unconfirmed credentials and unauthorized access to restricted spaces. He used all the right language, all the professional phrasing, but inside he was scrambling. Something about how easily she let herself be taken, how clean her movements were, it felt wrong. He tried to shake it off. He had the upper hand. She was in his station now. And even if she had a badge, what would she do? Publicly claim false arrest? That would require her to expose why she was really there, which would ruin whatever cover she was operating under. In his mind, she was boxed in. Silenced. But downstairs, Ayanna wasn't rattled. She was connecting dots. Listening. Watching. Every guard that avoided her eyes. Every assistant who paused when checking her paperwork. She didn't need a badge to hold power. She was the badge. And every minute she sat in that room, more pieces of the puzzle aligned. She now had proof of retaliation, racial profiling, abuse of authority. But she needed more. She needed the reaction. The overreach. She needed them to expose just how far they were willing to go to protect the lie they'd built. And she knew Mallory. He would overreach. The next few hours were a slow, deliberate descent into that overreach. Mallory called in Carter and Nolan again, this time pressing them on what she had said during the arrest. Did she say anything about credentials? Carter shrugged, yeah, but she didn't show anything. She looked like she wanted to, but we were already moving her out. Mallory snapped, then we stick to the report. She didn't produce ID. Period. Nolan looked uneasy. What if she sues? Mallory's voice dropped, then she sues. You want to be the officer who questioned a superior during an internal crisis? No. Then do your job. Elsewhere, Simone was back on the phone, speaking to someone from a restricted FBI line, the kind of number you only dial when you're ready for everything to change. She's here. Yes, she's calm. Too calm. What do you want me to do? There was a pause. A voice on the other end said just 2 words, observe everything. Outside, protesters were beginning to gather. Word had leaked that a high-profile federal agent had been arrested. Local activists didn't need a name. The image alone, a black woman in cuffs, flanked by white officers, was enough to ignite fury. Chants started. Signs went up. News vans arrived. The precinct began to feel less like a center of law and more like a stage. Mallory looked out his office window and muttered, "This is getting out of hand." Inside the building, Ayanna was moved to an interview room under the pretense of a formal questioning. But she knew better. This wasn't procedure. It was intimidation. Mallory finally entered the room with his usual performative calm. He didn't sit. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to look casual, but every muscle in his face betrayed his tension. "You've made quite the scene today," he began, voice dripping with arrogance. Ayanna looked up, unfazed. "I could say the same about you." He ignored the jab, stepping closer. "I remember you, you know. Always watching. Always filing reports. Like you were saving the world. Guess it didn't get you far. She didn't blink. You don't see it, do you? Mallory scoffed, see what? She smiled softly. The cracks. They've been spreading under your feet for years. And now you're standing on nothing. Mallory's smirk faltered for a split second, just long enough to register, before he turned away, muttering, "You're delusional." But inside, he wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't fighting to get out. She wasn't begging for justice. She wasn't playing victim. And that terrified him. He left the room without another word. That night, Ayanna was released quietly, with no charges. Officially, it was labeled a miscommunication. Unofficially, it was damage control. But by then, the damage was already done, to them. News had reached DC. The video clips were circulating. And more importantly, her plan had worked. They'd exposed themselves. But it wasn't over. She returned to her apartment in silence, greeted only by the dull hum of her refrigerator and the blinking red light on her laptop, a secure channel awaiting confirmation. She pressed the key and a voice came through. "We've received all recordings. Everything's in place. Are you ready to proceed?" Ayanna stared at her own reflection in the dark screen, then replied, "Not yet. Let them think they've won a little longer. Because this wasn't just a takedown. It was a reckoning. And every step they took to silence her had only amplified her voice. The city was watching. The country was curious. The officers were slipping. And something massive was coming. But what exactly had she prepared? And how would she bring down a system that thought it couldn't fall? The answer was only moments away. The morning after her quiet release, Richmond looked like a city holding its breath. News vans still hovered around the precinct, but the real storm was brewing far from the cameras. In a downtown federal building, a war room had been assembled, digital evidence glowing across multiple monitors, agents speaking in low voices, timelines mapped on the wall with laser precision. Ayanna stood at the center of it all, no longer dressed in plain clothes. Her navy blazer bore the gold pin of her office, her posture rigid, her eyes cold. Every file, every image on those screens, was the result of weeks of strategy, years of experience, and a plan set in motion long before Mallory ever tried to touch her. Now it was time to pull the trigger. Inside the precinct, Mallory had started to feel the ripple of unease growing wider. That morning, an internal memo landed in his inbox with an unfamiliar code, a quiet notification that an external audit had been activated under federal jurisdiction. At first, he dismissed it as a formality. But then the phone started ringing. First it was legal. Then internal affairs. Then the mayor's office. And all of them were asking the same question he couldn't answer: why was the FBI director's name connected to an arrest report he had signed off on? "Sir, did you know she was federal?" a young officer asked him in the hallway, nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot. Mallory gritted his teeth and forced a smirk. "She wasn't carrying ID, that's not on us." But even he could hear how hollow that sounded. The hallway was quieter than usual. Eyes didn't meet his like they used to. Confidence had been replaced with doubt. And he knew the temperature was changing fast. Later that afternoon, Ayanna walked into that same precinct, not escorted, not hesitant, but with purpose, her ID displayed openly and visibly, flanked by 2 senior agents. The front desk officer froze as she approached. "Director," he managed to say, confused and panicked. She didn't slow down. "Where's Captain Mallory?" she asked, her voice sharp, not raised, but powerful enough to silence the room. No one dared stop her. Upstairs, Mallory stood in his office, watching from the window as she approached. For a moment, he didn't move. His reflection stared back at him, and in it, he saw everything unraveling, every lie, every report he twisted, every second he underestimated her. He turned quickly and tried to gather himself, but the moment she entered, there was no more illusion of control. She closed the door behind her slowly, almost gently, then stood silently, looking around the office. He tried to speak, but she beat him to it. "You made this personal," she said, her voice even, deliberate. "And that was your mistake." Mallory scoffed, trying to recover. "You think you can walk in here and I can walk wherever I want," she cut him off, her eyes locked onto his. "Because while you've spent years building a kingdom of fear, I've spent months building a case. A case with your name on every page." His posture stiffened. "You can't prove anything. You mean other than your voice on tape calling me another problem off the streets? Or the footage of you instructing your officers to falsify reports? Or the sworn statements from 3 courthouse employees who saw you smirk as I was dragged away in cuffs?" She took a step closer. "I don't need to prove anything anymore. You already did that for me." Mallory's face went pale, but his pride wouldn't let him break. "So what, you want me to beg? Apologize? That's not going to happen." "I didn't come here for an apology," Ayanna replied, her tone unshaken. "I came here so you could look me in the eye one last time before the system you abuse turns its full weight against you." A long silence followed. He didn't speak. Didn't move. She took one final glance around the room, then turned to the door. "Just before leaving," she said, "Oh, and by the way, the cameras weren't just in my clothes. You've been under surveillance for weeks. Your office. Your calls. Your texts. Every threat you made to cover this up. Every dollar you redirected to protect your boys. It's all been documented. Every detail. This wasn't just a mission, Dean. This was a takedown." She exited without waiting for his reaction. Outside the office, a team of agents stood waiting, badges visible, ready to escort him out. But Mallory didn't walk out in cuffs like he deserved. Not yet. The arrest was scheduled for the next morning, a public arrest, one that would take place on the courthouse steps, the same ones he dragged her down days before. That was intentional. Symbolic. Precise. That night, the story broke. Not in whispers, but in sirens. News anchors repeated her name like an anthem. FBI director orchestrates undercover operation to expose corruption in Richmond PD. Screens showed footage of her being dragged out in cuffs, overlaid with voiceovers from press briefings revealing that the arrest had been part of a coordinated federal sting operation. The internet exploded. Hashtags lit up. Protesters returned, this time not in outrage, but in vindication. And the officers who laughed during her humiliation now sat in silence, watching as their leader's empire crumbled live on television. Ayanna sat alone in her apartment, the room dim, the only light coming from her television screen. A clip played of a reporter saying, "Her silent strength throughout this entire situation reminds us what true leadership looks like. Not revenge. Not rage. But accountability. Intentional, fearless, unshakable accountability." She muted the sound and stared at the screen. Behind her, Simone entered quietly with 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one beside Ayanna, then sat down. "You could have stopped them sooner," she said, gently. Ayanna nodded, not taking her eyes off the screen. "Yeah. But they needed to feel safe first. They needed to think they'd won." Simone leaned back, sighing, "They won't forget this." "They shouldn't," Ayanna said softly. "Some things need to leave a scar." The clock ticked. Outside, the city didn't sleep. Reporters stayed live through the night. Calls poured into the FBI headquarters. The story had become more than an operation. It had become a reckoning. Not just for one woman. But for every person who had been silenced, doubted, humiliated in the name of procedure. And yet, the final piece of the plan hadn't been played. Not yet. Because there was one final twist no one saw coming. And when it dropped, it would change everything. The sky over Richmond was overcast that morning, the kind of gray that swallowed the light and pressed a strange stillness into the streets. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed not with traffic or routine, but with tension, a city holding its breath. Media trucks lined the block, reporters pacing with microphones in hand, camera crews adjusting angles, waiting for something they couldn't quite explain. They knew the FBI had confirmed an arrest was scheduled, and the whispers said it was big. But what none of them knew, what not even Mallory's closest allies suspected, was that they weren't just about to witness an arrest. They were about to watch a man's legacy shatter in real time. Inside the courthouse lobby, Ayanna stood near the columns, eyes calm but unblinking. She wore a dark tailored suit, her badge clipped visibly this time, her shoulders squared with quiet authority. Next to her, Simone adjusted the cuffs of her jacket, scanning the rotunda like a sentry. Behind them, federal agents waited in a tight perimeter, plain clothes but unmistakably alert. This was more than a takedown, it was a statement. At precisely 9:17 a.m., Mallory arrived. He didn't come alone. 2 officers walked with him, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, but his jaw was locked, his step slower than usual. The second he stepped through the glass doors, he saw her. He didn't flinch, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, disbelief or perhaps, deep down, regret. Ayanna stepped forward slowly, her voice cutting through the quiet space like a blade. "Captain Dean Mallory. As of this moment, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsification of federal records, abuse of authority, and retaliation against a federal officer." Mallory opened his mouth, but no words came. "For years," she continued, her voice unwavering, "you operated under the belief that your badge made you untouchable. That the system would always bend to protect your name. Today, that ends." One of the agents stepped forward and began reading him his rights, but the sound barely registered over the sea of camera flashes exploding outside. As the doors opened and Mallory was led out in cuffs, reporters erupted in shouts, microphones thrust forward, their voices overlapping in chaos. But none of that noise could drown out the quiet intensity on Ayanna's face. She didn't blink. She didn't celebrate. She just watched. Mallory, for the first time in his career, looked small. Not because of the cuffs or the crowd, but because the illusion had finally been stripped away. As he passed Ayanna, he muttered under his breath, "You planned this." She didn't hesitate. "I built it." The crowd outside parted as the agents moved forward. Mallory's name was shouted over and over, mixed with disbelief and rage. Some called it justice. Some called it too late. But Ayanna knew what it was. It was necessary. Back inside the courthouse, Ayanna returned to a private conference room where a group of senior DOJ officials, civil rights attorneys, and federal observers had gathered. Among them was Darnell Hughes, a seasoned federal prosecutor known for his precise words and no-nonsense demeanor. As she entered, he stood and gave a short nod. "It's done," he said. "And it's clean." Ayanna sat down, folding her hands on the table. "It has to stay clean. This isn't just about Mallory. It's about proving the system can correct itself." Darnell nodded, but there was tension in his shoulders. "There's something else," he said carefully. "We traced Mallory's financials further. There are transactions that lead to 2 city council members, a judge, and possibly a district attorney." The room went still. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "So this rabbit hole goes deeper." He nodded. "Much deeper." She leaned back in her chair, her mind moving fast. "Then we keep going." Later that evening, as the story unfolded across every major news outlet, Ayanna was invited to speak at a closed press conference. She didn't want a podium or a speech. She wanted one camera, one statement, and no edits. When she stepped in front of the camera, the room fell silent. Reporters leaned in. Cameramen adjusted their focus. Her voice was calm but firm. "This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. Every time the system fails to act, it sends a message, that silence is safer than truth. Today, we sent a different message. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle. To the officers who stood by and said nothing, this is your wake-up call. To those who think rank shields them from consequence, this is your reminder. And to every black woman who's been disrespected, underestimated, or dismissed, this is your moment. We are not invisible. We are not small. And we are not done. As she stepped away from the camera, Simone met her with a look that held both pride and worry. That was bold. Ayanna replied without looking back, it had to be. That night, Mallory sat alone in a federal holding cell, the silence around him deafening. No phone. No support. No allies rushing to defend him. The weight of everything he had built, and everything he had destroyed, now pressed down on him like lead. He had spent his life believing that his name was armor. But Ayanna had peeled away every layer until all that was left was a man whose power was borrowed and whose legacy was hollow. Across town, Ayanna sat quietly on her balcony, the city lights stretching out in front of her. She could hear faint sirens in the distance, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the night air. Simone joined her with a soft clink of 2 coffee mugs, handing her one wordlessly. Do you feel anything? Simone asked, not in judgment, but curiosity. Ayanna considered that. I feel tired, she admitted. Simone nodded, sipping from her cup. But you did it. Ayanna looked out at the horizon. I didn't do it for me. I did it so no one else would have to. Silence stretched between them, but it was peaceful now, not the heavy silence of injustice, but the calm after a battle survived. But just as they sat in that brief stillness, Ayanna's phone buzzed. A secure line. She answered. A voice on the other end spoke quickly. Director, we've uncovered evidence suggesting this wasn't isolated. There's another precinct. Another unit. Same patterns. Different city. Ayanna exhaled, slow and steady. Send me everything. As the call ended, Simone looked at her. More work. Ayanna stood, steadying herself. Always. And with that, the night continued. Because for some, justice is a destination. But for Ayanna, it's a calling. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't offer peace, only questions. After the cameras had stopped flashing, after the agents had packed up their evidence, and the headlines began shifting from shock to analysis, Ayanna found herself walking the hallways of the federal building late into the night, heels echoing softly through marble corridors. The arrest of Captain Mallory had reverberated far beyond Richmond. She hadn't expected the wave to swell this fast, but now the real challenge had arrived, what to do with everything it uncovered. Because the corruption wasn't isolated. The rot had roots. Every thread pulled from Mallory's dealings revealed more names, more complicity, more people in power who had quietly enabled the abuse in exchange for silence, loyalty, or favors. The scope of the operation that had started as a calculated sting had evolved into something far more dangerous, a reckoning with the very system she had sworn to protect. The next morning, Ayanna entered a closed-door meeting with top federal officials and representatives from the DOJ. The room was quiet, but heavy. The kind of heaviness that comes when power must face its own reflection. There were murmurs of concern about the political fallout, the public perception, the message being sent. One official, a senior liaison from the Attorney General's office, leaned forward with a carefully measured tone. You understand that what you've done, it's going to open floodgates. People will start digging everywhere. They'll want to know how this went on for so long. Ayanna didn't blink. Good, she replied flatly, because they should have been digging years ago. Another man, younger, more cautious, rubbed his hands together as he spoke. Director, we're behind you, but this could destabilize entire departments. Judges, DAs, city council members, they're going to be exposed. If we move too fast, we could fracture the trust in local law enforcement across the state. Her voice didn't raise, but it cut sharper than anything else in the room. Trust in law enforcement was fractured the moment good people watched bad ones abuse their badges and said nothing. What we're doing isn't destabilizing the system, it's stabilizing truth. She knew the dilemma they were facing. To continue meant risking institutional embarrassment. To stop meant enabling further silence. It wasn't a legal battle anymore, it was a moral one. And Ayanna had already chosen her side. But what weighed on her now wasn't just the exposure of names and crimes. It was what would be left in the aftermath. Communities would be shaken. Innocent officers would be pulled into public doubt. Careers would end, not all of them guilty. But collateral damage was inevitable when cleaning out a house infested with decay. Later that week, she visited a local community center in Southside Richmond, a place where she had once volunteered as a teenager. It was quieter than she remembered, and the walls seemed more faded. The director of the center, Ms. Lorraine, hugged her tightly upon arrival. They sat in her office, a cramped space filled with paper files and photos of local kids. Lorraine looked tired, but proud. "You did what nobody else dared to do," she said. "But you know what's coming, right? These streets, they're going to feel it. The backlash. The confusion." Ayanna nodded, her throat tight. "I know. That's why I'm here." They talked for over an hour, about rebuilding trust, about mentoring programs, about creating support for those who would feel displaced as the city reeled from what was unfolding. Ayanna didn't want to just expose injustice. She wanted to make room for something better to take its place. She left the center with a renewed urgency, but also with a quiet ache in her chest. Because justice, no matter how necessary, always left a bruise behind. Across the city, the other officers who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Mallory now found themselves under investigation. Some had already resigned. Others had gone silent, lawyered up, vanished from public view. Carter, one of the younger officers involved in Ayanna's arrest, had been summoned for questioning. Sitting across from federal investigators, his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I didn't know," he said, voice cracking. "I was just following orders. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what he was doing." One of the agents leaned forward, calm but firm. "You didn't need to know who she was to know what you did was wrong. Did you question anything? Did you speak up when it felt off?" Carter looked down, guilt etched into every feature. "No. I didn't. I thought if I questioned him, I'd be done. And I needed this job." His answer wasn't unique. It was the chorus echoing across departments, fear disguised as loyalty, silence masked as survival. But Ayanna had made it clear from the beginning, complicity wasn't a defense anymore. She wasn't interested in punishment for the sake of spectacle. She wanted transformation. And that required more than arrests. It required truth. As public trust began to teeter, Ayanna scheduled a televised roundtable discussion, not with other officials, but with victims of abuse, civil rights leaders, and members of the community who had been unheard for too long. She sat at a wide table under soft lights, looking not like a politician, but like someone willing to listen. The discussion was raw. Emotional. A young mother spoke about her son being profiled at 15. An older man shared how his brother had been imprisoned based on a false confession obtained by Mallory's unit years ago. Every story was wound, reopened on live television. Ayanna listened to all of them. Not as a federal officer. As a woman who had felt the sting herself. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was low. "I don't have the words to erase what happened to you. I don't have the power to undo your pain. But I do have a responsibility, to make sure this system doesn't keep repeating the same sins. This isn't the end of something. It's the beginning. And I can't do it alone." That night, social media erupted again, but this time, it wasn't outrage. It was unity. The clip of her speech went viral. Hashtags turned from anger to resolve. Ayanna had become more than a symbol. She had become a leader people could believe in, not because she promised perfection, but because she delivered truth without disguise. But not everyone was ready to let go. Behind the scenes, whispers began swirling of interference. Some politicians, desperate to protect their names, tried to stall investigations. There were rumors of documents disappearing, of evidence being buried. One night, Simone entered Ayanna's office with a folder, her expression unreadable. She placed it gently on the desk. "You need to see this," she said. Inside were files detailing an anonymous tip. Someone close to the original task force had been leaking information. Someone who had access to sealed warrants. Ayanna's stomach turned. Betrayal within her own walls. It wasn't shocking, but it was sobering. She stared at the files for a long moment, then closed them. "Get me their name," she said. The deeper she went, the more it became clear, the system she was trying to fix had learned how to protect itself in the shadows. Every truth exposed seemed to trigger another lie trying to crawl back in. And now she was faced with a brutal realization. The reckoning wasn't just public. It was personal. Every decision she made from here on could cost her more than her position, it could cost her the very soul of the mission. But she didn't hesitate. Because the time for compromise had passed. And now, with the city watching, the enemies hiding, and the clock ticking, Ayanna knew the final move was approaching. And it would shake everything. The fluorescent lights of Ayanna's office buzzed faintly overhead as she sat in stillness, the cityscape behind her window glowing in restless orange. The folder Simone had handed her hours earlier still sat unopened on the desk in front of her, though she knew exactly what it held: betrayal. Not the kind that comes from enemies, but the kind that wounds deeper because it comes from someone trusted, someone allowed close enough to know where to strike. Her fingers hovered over the flap of the folder for several moments before she finally opened it, the rustle of paper suddenly louder than anything else in the room. Inside, redacted reports, printed email logs, and surveillance notes pointed to a name she hadn't expected: Agent Marcus Delroy, one of the agents originally assigned to her inner circle during the planning stages of Operation Integrity. He'd been there from the start, sitting quietly in the corner of strategy meetings, offering minimal opinions but always volunteering for data compilation, access coordination, and report oversight. He was always helpful, always reliable, perhaps too much so. Simone stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly, anger etched into the corners of her mouth. He leaked the arrest timeline to someone inside the district attorney's office 2 days before we went public. We didn't catch it at the time, but it's all here. He used a personal device that piggybacked off the secure server and rerouted the data. Ayanna looked up at her, jaw clenched. "Why?" she asked, more to herself than anyone else. Simone answered softly, "He's connected to Councilwoman Reeves. Financially. Campaign donations, shared contacts. My guess is he was feeding her enough to protect the ones still hiding in the cracks." Ayanna exhaled slowly, her chest tightening with a familiar ache, disappointment layered on top of exhaustion. She rose from her chair, pacing slowly, staring out at the glowing buildings. "So now we have to go after one of our own." "Publicly," she said, her voice low, heavy. Simone nodded without hesitation. "If we're going to clean this mess up, we can't make exceptions. You said it yourself, complicity isn't an excuse." Ayanna turned, eyes sharp. "It's not. But we both know what happens when the public sees division inside the Bureau. They'll start questioning the foundation of everything we've built. And we're not done yet." Simone stepped closer. "Ayanna, I don't think you understand, he's been leaking for months. It's not just timeline data. It's surveillance notes, operational movements, profiles on witnesses. There's a good chance people are in danger because of what he gave them." The words hit like a blow to the gut. Ayanna sat back down, running her hands across her face, trying to collect her thoughts. She had spent her career calculating risks, protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, believing that the integrity of the mission always justified the burden. But now she was staring at the cost. Real lives. Real danger. And the weight of it was nearly unbearable. They called Marcus into the office at 6:23 the next morning. He entered without hesitation, his face calm, even warm, as if he was walking into a routine debrief. When he saw both Ayanna and Simone waiting, the door shut behind him with a soft but final click. Ayanna didn't waste time. "Have a seat," she said, her tone giving no room for small talk. Marcus looked at her, then at Simone, and slowly lowered himself into the chair. "Something wrong?" he asked, too casually. She slid the folder across the desk toward him. "We know it was you." His face didn't change at first. He looked at the folder but didn't open it. Then he sat back and tilted his head slightly. "You really think I'm the only one?" he asked, almost mocking in tone. "You think I did this alone?" Ayanna leaned forward, her voice tight with restrained fury. "I don't care how many people you think are behind you. Right now, I'm looking at the one who betrayed every name on our protection list. You didn't just leak information, Marcus. You jeopardized lives." For the first time, his mask cracked. "You want to know why? Because you made this personal. You came back here and treated this whole thing like some righteous crusade, like you were saving us from ourselves. But you didn't stop to ask who'd been surviving in this system long before you got here. You think Mallory was the only one who abused power? This city was never clean. You just brought cameras to the crime scene." Ayanna's eyes darkened. "So you chose to protect the crime instead of fight it?" Marcus shrugged. "I chose to protect stability. You think tearing down the wall makes you a hero? Sometimes the wall is the only thing keeping the whole place from burning down." Simone stepped in, her voice sharp. "No, Marcus. You didn't protect anything. You sold your silence. You traded justice for access. That's not stability, that's cowardice." He looked at her, jaw twitching, then turned back to Ayanna. "So what now? You gonna parade me out like you did Mallory? Feed me to the same cameras you weaponized against him?" Ayanna's voice was cold. "You won't get the cameras. You don't deserve them. But you will be held accountable." Later that day, a quiet internal arrest was made. Marcus Delroy was removed from duty, his clearance revoked, and formal charges filed. No press conference. No statement. Just the quiet hum of consequence doing its work. But Ayanna knew this was only the beginning. If Marcus had been compromised, others might be too. It meant more vetting. More recalibration. And less room for trust. Still, momentum didn't stop. The investigation into Councilwoman Reeves and her involvement with suppressed misconduct reports moved forward. One by one, subpoenas were issued. Digital footprints examined. Financial records exposed. And all across Richmond, people in power began to squirm under the pressure of their own shadows. The deeper Ayanna went, the more the moral ground beneath her seemed to shift. She had always believed in justice as a clear path, hard, yes, but steady. Now, each step felt like a choice between lesser evils. Do you expose another judge if it means stalling legal proceedings for dozens of pending cases? Do you bring down another precinct knowing that some good officers will be swept up in the storm? The questions came faster than the answers. Late one night, she sat with Simone in the dim light of the office, papers spread across the table. "Do you ever wonder if this is too big for us?" Ayanna asked quietly, not as a leader, but as a woman burdened by the truth. Simone looked at her for a long moment. "I think it's too big for anyone who wants to carry it alone." Ayanna nodded slowly. "I can't stop now." "You won't," Simone said. "And we won't let you." In the days that followed, something unexpected began to rise in the city. Amid the tension, people started stepping forward, citizens who had remained silent for years now coming with stories, with documents, with names. A retired dispatcher delivered a box of tapes she'd kept hidden for fear of retaliation. A former officer confessed to falsifying evidence under pressure. A young woman handed over emails between her brother and a former ADA that confirmed long-rumored bribes. The floodgates had opened, not in chaos, but in clarity. And Ayanna, watching it all unfold, realized that this was the true measure of impact. Not just in the arrests or headlines, but in the courage it sparked in others. In the fear it finally silenced. In the quiet, determined march of truth reclaiming space. But still, something lingered. A final piece. An unanswered question. A decision that would require everything she had left. And one final confrontation that would decide not just the legacy of the operation, but the future of every person still watching from the sidelines, waiting to see if justice was real, or just another performance. And that choice, that final test, was waiting just around the corner. The storm that had once swirled in the shadows was now unfolding in full daylight, and Ayanna could feel its weight pressing down with every decision she made. The city was no longer whispering, it was watching, questioning, expecting. What had started as a mission to expose corruption had evolved into something far more fragile, a test of how deeply a broken system could be corrected without collapsing entirely. And now, the case files spread across her desk felt less like paper and more like pulses of living trauma, each page soaked in the silence of someone who had waited too long to be heard. It was no longer just about dismantling a corrupt precinct or outing individual bad actors. It had become about restoring belief, not in her, but in something greater, something collective. The idea that justice wasn't a myth, or a transaction, or a weapon wielded by the powerful, but something worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In the wake of Marcus Delroy's arrest, a new kind of tension settled over the department. Trust was thinner now. Every hallway carried glances that held more questions than answers. Agents who once walked confidently now moved with measured caution, double-checking clearances, questioning protocol. Ayanna understood the fallout. She welcomed it. Accountability always comes with discomfort. But what she hadn't expected was the ripple of introspection that began surfacing among her own team. People were asking themselves where their silence had been complicit, where their loyalty had blurred into passivity. It was painful, but it was real, and for Ayanna, that pain was necessary. The wound had to bleed before it could heal. That week, she held a private meeting with a small group of officers from the local precinct still operating under investigation. Among them was Officer Karen Bailey, a veteran with 2 decades on the force, known for her quiet professionalism and a spotless record. Karen had requested to speak privately after the main session, and Ayanna agreed. They sat in a quiet room, the door closed behind them, tension breathing between the walls. "I'm not here to defend what's been done," Karen began, her voice firm but laced with something more vulnerable underneath. "I've seen things over the years that I should have spoken out against. I stayed quiet because I told myself I wasn't the problem. That I was different. But maybe that's not enough anymore." Ayanna watched her closely, sensing the weight behind her words. "Why now?" she asked, not accusatory, but searching. Karen looked down, her fingers twisting the edges of her sleeve. "Because I watched you stand there on those courthouse steps and tell the world what no one else had the courage to say. And because I realized that silence doesn't protect you from guilt. It just delays the crash." Ayanna nodded slowly. "It takes strength to admit that. But strength isn't enough if it stops at admission. What are you willing to do with it?" Karen's eyes lifted. "Whatever it takes. I have evidence. Logs. Testimonies. Things that were buried. And people who'll talk, if they know it won't destroy their lives." Ayanna leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. "Then let's make sure it doesn't. Bring it to me. All of it. We protect the truth and the people who carry it." Karen exhaled, a trembling release of years she hadn't let herself feel. She left that office with purpose, and Ayanna sat in silence for a long moment afterward, knowing that real change wasn't coming from institutions, it was coming from individuals choosing courage over comfort. But the quiet didn't last. 2 days later, Ayanna received word that the attorney representing Councilwoman Reeves had filed an injunction to block the release of financial records critical to the case. The move was bold, a direct attempt to halt momentum by invoking procedural delays. And it sent a clear message: power wasn't going down without a fight. Ayanna attended the emergency court session personally, choosing not to delegate. In the courtroom, the energy was tense, thick with eyes and cameras. The defense painted a picture of overreach, of political targeting, of public pressure tainting due process. But when Ayanna was called to speak, she didn't come with theatrics. She came with facts. She stepped to the stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise, it cut. This is not about politics. This is not about revenge. This is about decades of misconduct funded by public trust and protected by silence. Councilwoman Reeves knowingly accepted campaign funds traced to officers under active federal investigation. She used her influence to stall inquiries, to bury complaints, to silence whistleblowers. The evidence isn't circumstantial. It's documented. And the people of this city deserve to see it. There was no applause, no reaction, just the stillness of a room realizing that truth had entered the room uninvited, and was refusing to leave. The judge ruled in Ayanna's favor. The records would be unsealed. That night, back at headquarters, Simone approached her with a grave look. There's chatter online. Not just trolling. Organized threats. They're targeting your name, your image, your family. Ayanna nodded. I expected it. Simone hesitated. We can escalate your security detail. Ayanna turned to face her. No. We protect the work. We don't hide behind it. Simone didn't argue, but the worry in her eyes lingered. Because the more Ayanna pulled back the veil, the more enemies she exposed, enemies with money, power, reach. And somewhere in that widening circle was someone willing to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The next morning, Ayanna received an anonymous package. No note. No return address. Inside was a printed photograph, a shot of her mother's old house in Richmond, the door spray-painted with the word traitor. No threats. Just a message of intimidation, clear as day. Ayanna stared at the photo for a long time, the stillness around her growing thicker, deeper. Then she placed it in an evidence bag, handed it to her assistant, and returned to work without a word. The mission didn't pause for fear. But that night, as she sat alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to feel the crack that had begun to form. Not doubt, she didn't doubt the mission. But the fatigue was seeping into her bones in ways she hadn't anticipated. The kind of fatigue that doesn't come from action, but from knowing that every victory only reveals another battlefield. She picked up her phone and called her mother. Dolores answered on the third ring. Her voice was still strong, still grounded in the rhythm of old hymns and harder years. Ayanna didn't mention the photo. Didn't mention the threats. She just listened to her mother talk about the church fundraiser, about how the young people were finally stepping up to repaint the community center. When Dolores paused and asked, "You still fighting?" Ayanna replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "Every day." And her mother, without hesitation, said, "Then keep standing, baby. They only try to scare the ones they know are changing something." Ayanna didn't cry. But the silence after that call felt like healing. The following day, a report came in confirming that 2 former officers connected to Mallory's network had attempted to flee the state. They were apprehended quietly, brought in for questioning. And in exchange for immunity, one of them began naming names, judges, prosecutors, even journalists who had accepted payment for silence or bias. The map of corruption, once thought to be a few bad apples, was beginning to look like an entire orchard gone rotten. But Ayanna didn't flinch. She expanded the investigation. Reassigned agents. Cleared new warrants. Simone approached her late that evening, her tone careful. If we go this far, it won't just be Richmond. We'll be pulling federal partners. Making enemies in other states. Ayanna looked at her, calm and clear. Good. Let them know we're not afraid of the truth anymore. And that was when it truly began, not the operation, not the arrest, but the movement. Because Ayanna had stopped playing defense. She wasn't just dismantling injustice. She was rebuilding the definition of what justice could look like. And with every lie uncovered, with every truth held up to the light, the world was watching to see one thing: would the system finally bend to righteousness? Or would it break entirely? That answer was coming. And Ayanna would be the one to deliver it. When the final indictments came down, the city barely had time to brace. Councilwoman Reeves was arrested at her home in the early hours of a rainy Tuesday morning, caught off guard, her carefully curated political image collapsing under the weight of wire transfers, encrypted messages, and a trail of deceit she could no longer outrun. The footage was quiet, not dramatic, no yelling, no spectacle, just a woman in silk pajamas lowering her head as federal agents placed her in cuffs. For the public, it was confirmation. For Ayanna, it was closure. Not the type you celebrate, but the kind that settles into your chest like an exhale you've held far too long. In the weeks that followed, more names fell. Judges who had tampered with cases were forced to resign. A journalist from a major outlet lost his career after evidence surfaced that he had received payments to discredit victims. One of the prosecutors tied to the cover-up struck a deal in exchange for exposing a string of falsified convictions. Each fall, each reckoning, didn't just bring justice, it unearthed layers of pain that had been buried under decades of forced silence. Communities across the city began holding their own forums, not led by institutions, but by residents who finally felt seen. Ayanna didn't attend them all, but her presence was felt in every seat, every mic passed between trembling hands, every story told that had once been locked behind fear. Simone, always by Ayanna's side, was promoted to Deputy Director of Federal Oversight, a title she accepted with grace and purpose. Her office became a bridge between community voices and government action. She created programs that redirected resources into neighborhood initiatives, police reform education, and trauma recovery services for those most affected by misconduct. No longer just an enforcer, Simone had become a builder, someone who didn't just dismantle systems but designed better ones to take their place. Karen Bailey became a leading figure in officer reform, helping retrain police units with a focus on empathy, transparency, and accountability. She never tried to absolve herself. She spoke plainly about the cost of silence, the danger of apathy. She stood in rooms full of cadets and told them the truth, that wearing a badge is not permission to be feared, but a responsibility to be worthy of trust. Her voice, once buried behind decades of protocol, had become a tool of change. As for Marcus Delroy, his case went to trial. He pleaded guilty, and though many expected a quiet sentence, Ayanna insisted on transparency. During the sentencing, he was given the opportunity to speak. He admitted to his betrayal. Not out of remorse, but recognition. "I thought I was playing the game," he said, "but I didn't realize I was the one being used." He received 7 years in federal prison. Ayanna didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. His fall wasn't her victory, it was a reminder that accountability reaches everyone, even the ones who once stood beside her. Mallory, still awaiting trial, remained in federal custody. His defense team attempted every trick in the book, but the mountain of evidence, the recordings, the reports, the testimonies, was insurmountable. His name, once uttered with authority, now carried the bitter taste of disgrace. Behind bars, the control he once used to dominate others had evaporated. And though Ayanna never wished suffering on anyone, she believed in consequence. Not to destroy, but to teach. Mallory became the cautionary tale no badge could protect. And then there was Ayanna. Months passed. Investigations closed. Reforms were implemented. Her mission had shifted from confrontation to reconstruction. She declined offers to run for office, to appear on major talk shows, to become a public figure beyond her title. She didn't want a spotlight, she wanted a legacy. And in a quiet press conference held at the same courthouse where everything began, she announced her resignation as FBI director. There was no scandal. No pressure. Just a woman who had completed the mission she was called to carry. Her words were simple: I never wanted power. I wanted justice. And now that the system has been shaken awake, it's time for new voices to lead it forward. Her departure didn't mark an end, it ignited a new era. She returned to her roots, moving back to the south side of Richmond. She began teaching part-time at a local university, leading lectures on systemic reform, public ethics, and the psychology of silence. Her students hung on every word, not because of her title, but because she had lived the war she was teaching them to fight. She also started a foundation in her mother's name, the Dolores Project, dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and survivors of institutional abuse. It became a safe haven, a place where truth wasn't just spoken, but protected. One evening, long after the headlines faded and the protests became policies, Ayanna sat on her porch under a violet sky, watching kids play in the street. Simone pulled up with 2 coffees, as she always did. They sat in silence for a moment before Simone asked, "Do you ever miss it?" Ayanna smiled gently. "I miss the fight. But not the fire." Simone raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're done?" Ayanna looked out at the street, at the laughter, at the peace that had taken so much to build. "I'm never done," she said. "But I've learned something, sometimes leading means stepping aside so others can rise. The system doesn't change with one person. It changes when one person inspires many. Now, to you listening, yes, you, right now, I want you to sit with this for a moment. This wasn't just a story about a woman who was arrested and humiliated. It was about what she chose to do with that moment. About how she turned that pain into power, not to destroy, but to rebuild. And maybe you've been in a place like that. Maybe not in handcuffs, maybe not in a courtroom, but silenced. Ignored. Dismissed. Maybe someone looked at you and saw less than who you are. But the question is, what will you do with that moment? Because justice isn't some faraway idea. It's here. In our streets. In our jobs. In our schools. And in our choices. Every day. The lesson here isn't about revenge, it's about responsibility. About courage. About refusing to let silence win. So ask yourself, what are you willing to stand for, even when you stand alone? And if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or made you think, or gave you hope, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. And subscribe to this channel, Tales of Twist, where real, raw, and powerful stories come to life. Stories that challenge, that uplift, and that remind us that no matter how dark the road gets, truth always finds a way. We'll see you in the next twist.